Hello. This lecture will be on Horace. Horace was a Roman poet and critic, best known as a poet, satirist, really just all around renowned Roman poet. Sorry, I have a little bit of a sore throat. So, Horace's full name was Quintus Horatius or Horatius Flaccus. He lived from the year 65 BCE, which stands for before the Common Era, to the year 8 BCE. So, about 8 years before what we call the Common Era, or what used to be known as before the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, Horace was born in Venusia, which was a military colony in southern Italy. I don't actually believe that there's still a city there called Venusia. But as you can see there on the map, it's quite a bit of a distance from Rome, but that would have all been part of Roman territory. He was educated in Rome proper, in the city of Rome, during the transition from the Roman Republic to an empire. Just, in case you don't know what I mean by that, the Roman Empire was not always an empire. Basically, it starts off as a republic, and then the democratic republican elements get essentially squashed, and the empire rises up, which strengthens Rome in many ways as a military power, etc. But essentially sort of starts the process of its eventual decline. So Horace lived right in the middle of that. He was born into a somewhat wealthy family, although it's debated how wealthy they were. And as the really volatile political movements that were occurring between the Republic and the Empire, as those events were taking place, he was sort of in the middle of it, and well positioned to become who he was, but also really dangerous. And he was allied with a number of powerful Roman politicians, but he was not a politician himself. He was a rhetorician, so he helped write speeches. He trained people in speech giving, but he was primarily a professional poet, which is pretty rare in any time, but especially in antiquity. The way that he was able to make a career or a life out of that was that he had a patron named Maecenas, and this was a person who valued his work and essentially paid him to write poems, and to write satires, and to write speeches. He was also a friend and a peer to Virgil, who is pretty widely considered to be the greatest poet of the age, what is called the Augustan Age. Now, what we read was the Ars Poetica. The Ars Poetica is also known as the Epistle to the Pisones, because it was literally written as a letter to a particular family. It was written around the year 10 BCE, so 2 years before his death. And as you may have noticed when you read it, it's heavily, heavily influenced by Aristotle's Poetics. Now, it's actually more directly influential on the development of Western literature than um, the Poetics was. And there are many reasons to be given for this. Some are pretty direct and cultural. So, for example, just historically speaking, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire and sort of Roman hegemony in the region um, was closer historically to modernity than ancient Greece was. And as such, the language, Latin, would have been more accessible to scholars in Europe, in Western Europe, than ancient Greek. Um, there is also the fact that the Roman Empire um, sort of had a better infrastructure for preserving texts, the technologies for preservation and printing, storage, architecture were all more advanced. And so there was less risk of just losing texts. You may recall that when we talked about Aristotle, one of the things that was brought up was that Aristotle had written various treatises on comedy, on lyric poetry, on epic, and we've lost all of those. All we have is the Poetics as far as his aesthetic works. That was not out of the question in Rome, but it was a little bit less of a risk. And so there were, those factors. Some would say that Horace is more enjoyable to read as well. He cracks jokes. And then there's the fact that both of these authors, both of these works, the Poetics and Ars Poetica, sort of get revived with a certain level of enthusiasm in Europe and even in the Americas during the neoclassical period. So like late 17th, early 18th, or into the 18th century. And the neoclassicists revered the Greeks, but they really tried to emulate the Romans quite a bit more. Now, the next point here is related to that, which is that the Ars Poetica was especially crucial to the ideals of European neoclassicism in the 18th century. We haven't touched neoclassicism yet. We will, actually, very soon. But just in very broad strokes, neoclassicism is the movement in Western European art, as well as in others, but really it comes out of Western Europe. And it's a movement that is heavily indebted to the Greeks and Romans and tries to emulate them as an ideal of the arts and culture and philosophy and beauty. And so you get a lot of imitation of Greek and Roman models. And so an example of this would be the architecture of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is a heavily neoclassical city, at least the area around the Capitol. those columns and the style of the statues, all that white marble. That's very neoclassical. And actually, if you ever look up a shot from above, even the way that the streets are laid out, it's heavily influenced by the 18th century ideal of what they believed Greece and Rome to be. All right. And finally, Ars Poetica is first translated into English in 1566. That might not be the most important thing to you to recall, but as you'll see later, the translations into English carry with them some stylistic indications of the importance of this text to various schools and genres and styles of artist, writer, etc. over the years. Now, another reason that the Ars Poetica is very famous, I mean, the Poetics is also, but Ars Poetica, even for people who haven't read it, many of the terms are actually very recognizable to people because Horace sort of coined a number of new terms. One of these, which we actually used when we read Aristotle, is not from Aristotle, but is from Horace himself, which is in media res, which means into the middle of things. It's the idea that a plot of a narrative piece of literature, such as a drama or a story, does not begin right at the beginning. It always starts in the middle of something. There are a number of practical reasons for this, mostly having to do with length and attractiveness, really. You don't want to bore your audience. The opposite of this, or what this is contrasted with, would be ab ovo, which literally means from the egg, but it means from the beginning. You don't want to tell a story ab ovo, because if you say, for example, I'm going to tell, the story of the time I got into a car accident, and I'm going to tell it ab ovo. What is the beginning? Is it when I got into the car? Is it, when I bought the car? If you're going ab ovo, it's, you're always looking for some beginning that really has nothing to do with the central conflict that makes the story. So when you're looking for the beginning of a story, you don't want to go ab ovo, you want to go in media res. Another of his famous lines is ut pictura poesis or poesis, I'm not sure. And that is, as is painting, so is poetry. Basically, Horace is taking certain principles that have typically been applied to painting, and he's applying them to poetry. Now, remember, this is not, this is not without precedent. Even Aristotle, though he was not talking about painting per se, he was talking about drama. He was talking about a visual art, and he was very concerned not just with how it was written, but also with how it could be presented. Horace takes that a step further, and he basically says, look, the things that we talk about with painting can be also applied to verbal arts, such as poetry. Plato does something similar when he talks about imitation in general. He's talking about poetry, but the example that he gives is actually of a painting of a table, right? And so this analogy between painting and writing is something you're going to see quite a bit of, particularly with these early critics. And then we have Destinit in Pishem, which is it ends with a fish's tail, and that is his introductory crack at the sort of excessively imaginative and improper um, combination of body parts. And then there's finally a really common phrase now, which is purpureus panis, which is just purple prose. And purple prose refers to flowery language. And he's not using this as a compliment. When he says flowery language, he's not talking about language that is beautiful. He's talking about language that is excessively ornate, that tries to sound fancy but fails. The major concerns of the Ars Poetica are unity, which is the consistency or harmony of the various parts of a piece of writing. Decorum, which is the appropriate use of language. Art, which is poetry as a craft to be learned and practiced. And finally, the purpose, which is, as he says, to delight and instruct. And so these are the main concerns, and you'll notice that they overlap quite a bit. So decorum and unity basically go together. The purpose is sort of an umbrella directive, but these are his sort of four major concerns. Also, you'll notice on this slide that there is a page written in a sort of archaic English. This is an example of an early English translation of Horace, and it's written in very neoclassical verse, and anytime you take words from one language and put them into another language, you're going to lose something in translation. Languages don't map onto each other perfectly. Then if you take it and you translate it into poetry, especially a form of poetry that it wasn't originally written in, you're still going to lose more. So why would this translator do it this way? Well, one of the reasons they're doing it this way is that Horace wrote the Ars Poetica in a kind of loose poetic form. But it's not just that. Philosophically speaking, the neoclassicists, and this is a neoclassical translation, really took to heart this idea of there being rules. And so this sample here is indicative of that, this very strict adherence to a particular rhyme scheme and form. Now, unity gets discussed right from the start, or hinted at least, with this description where Horace says, imagine a painter wanting to attach a horse's neck to a human head, assemble limbs from everywhere, and add feathers of various colors, so that a woman beautiful above the waist tailed into a revolting black fish. Could you hold back your laughter, my friends, if admitted to view it? And as you see in the picture, which is not exactly what he describes there, but, pretty approximate, it's grotesque. This is not beautiful. It's not even something that can really be taken seriously. It's silly. And this is the problem of disunity. These things do not go together. What Horace wants more than anything is a harmonious combination of elements. Now, what he describes in this passage is essentially a really grotesque take on a mermaid. And mermaids, for much of history and throughout various cultures sort of differ in their depictions. Sometimes they're beautiful, but very, very often they're actually considered sort of horrifying. And so, if I take the same passage and I put it next to this painting by John William Waterhouse of a mermaid, um, you might think, it doesn't apply. And depending on what your opinions are on art, on Horace's ideals, you might be, that might hold that Horace's observations do not apply here. But I do want to also suggest that he encourages a look at some of the imperfections with an idea of a character like a mermaid. So, this depiction of a mermaid by John William Waterhouse would have been much more influenced by the Romantics. Waterhouse was not, strictly speaking, a Romantic painter. He was what was known as a pre-Raphaelite, but they were heavily influenced by the Romantics, and they held to a lot of Romantic ideals. And so it could be said that Waterhouse's approach to painting is in itself pretty far removed from the ideals of Horace. And, conversely, that Horace probably would not have been a fan of Waterhouse's painting. However, you look at this painting, it's definitely not as grotesque as the other one. Is it unified? I think most people would say yes. There is a balance to it. There's certainly beauty to it. However, look at the connection between the tail and the torso of the mermaid. What is that? Like, where does the human become fish? It looks like she's wearing pants. And I think that Horace, and this is me speculating, but I think that Horace would look at this and say, see, there's your problem. Sure, this is not a head of a horse. It's not as grotesque as what he describes, but it doesn't quite make sense. It's not harmonious. There's clearly a rupture here where you look at that and you go, that doesn't belong. So that's one take. In any case, unity is certainly a huge, huge concern, maybe the main concern to Horace, and this comes straight from Aristotle. In fact, if you go and you look up lines 179 to 262, which in our edition of the Norton Anthology is to be found on page 137 to 139. Those paragraphs in particular could have been taken straight out of Aristotle. Horace does take some liberties, and so, for example, he expands the number of actors to 5. But even so, the adherence to rules is very similar. And so, he doesn't expand the actors to 5. He expands the acts. He says that there can only be 5 acts, no more than 5. And if you look at Shakespeare's tragedies, they're all 5-act plays. He held to that very, very closely. So these rules were taken very seriously. Decorum is also from Aristotle. I'm not sure that the word decorum per se is to be found in our translation of the Poetics, but this idea of things being correct and appropriate is very consistent with the way that Aristotle discusses the concept of unity. It's a subset of this idea of unity. So if unity is a general desire for things to be, or not a general desire, but if unity is a general harmony between elements of a work of art, and these elements all sort of work together harmoniously and combine to make something beautiful, then decorum is the part of that that concerns itself with things being proper and appropriate, consistent, accurate. So he gives us this example where he says, if a speaker's words are not consonant with his fortunes, the people, both horse and foot, will burst out laughing. So, the basic thing, and Horace has this concern with laughter. He's always saying, how people are going to laugh. Obviously, he's talking about tragedy here. He's talking about the presentation of tragedy. You don't want people to laugh. And so what he's talking about, if a speaker's words are not consonant with his fortunes, fortunes there can mean many things, and all of them are correct for understanding this. So, for example, one's fortune can be their station in life. A nobleman versus a peasant. If we have a character who is very clearly presented as a peasant and he talks like a nobleman, that's going to be comical. All right. Unless there's some reason for it, like he's pretending or something, but that's going to have to be explained in the script, in the dialogue, and also, it's going to have to be plausible. So that would still be governed by the idea of decorum, of things being accurate, of things being appropriate, of things being consistent. All right. Likewise, you don't want to have a king who speaks like a peasant. That would be silly. But it's not just fortune in the sense of, what you're born with. It also has to do with your fortunes within the plot. Right? If something terrible happens to a character within a particular plot and they are not acting in a way that makes sense, then you do not have proper decorum. And as a result of that, you don't have unity and you violate all these rules. Basically, he's talking about consistency, accuracy, things being in their proper place, things looking and sounding the way that they should. All right. This sounds very strict when you describe it like this, but it's the type of thing that if you see it being violated, it's hard to deny the point. All right. A quick note: when he says both horse and foot, the reference there is to types of soldiers. A horseman would have typically been a nobleman, and in ancient Rome, many nobles were actually part of what was called an equestrian class. That literally meant horsemen, and then foot soldiers were of a lower station. So, for example, if you ever hear the term chevalier in French or in Spanish, caballero, it means gentleman, right? Well, why does caballero, chevalier, words that literally mean horse rider, why do those mean gentleman? Because a person who rode a horse traditionally, or who was associated with horse riding traditionally would have been considered a nobleman or a knight. Hence the horse shape in a chess game also being known as a knight. Anyway, that's neither here nor there with regards to this lesson, but something interesting. So decorum is a subset of unity, but it is more important to Horace. He spends more time on it, and even in the way that he discusses unity, he's often also referencing decorum. They're so close so that they're often used interchangeably. Um, and again, it denotes consistency of all kinds. All right, it's not just an aesthetic thing; it's also political, it's also social, rhetorical, philosophical, temporal, linguistic, etc. So, for example, um, just to go down this list, right? Political decorum. Right? You don't want to have a play in which um, characters with different levels of political power act in ways that are inconsistent with how we would know those characters to act. Likewise, socially, we would not have, um, high characters acting like low characters or vice versa. Aesthetically, you want decorum. Horace, like Aristotle, um, considers Deus ex machina to be improper, indecorous, cheap, right? Because it's inconsistent with the plot. It violates consistency, it violates unity, it violates harmony. You want rhetorical decorum. People should talk the way that the character you're trying to build would sound. Philosophical decorum would be a consistency of thought, both within the play and um, with the play's orientation to its audience. Right? Temporal decorum, meaning decorum of time. Remember that Aristotle basically says a play should not, or a plot should not last longer than 24 hours. Horace is not quite so strict, but he definitely has um, limits, restrictions. And then, linguistic. Um, he talks, for example, about the uses of Greek and Roman languages in poetry. All of this essentially equates to the idea of consistency, accuracy, etc. And all of this is an issue of mimesis, which is the aspect of art that concerns itself with imitation. So, um, much like the way that Aristotle talked about mimesis, um, Horace's concern with decorum is essentially the rule that covers plausibility, accuracy, all of that. He also makes some allowances, and I've already mentioned this, but even more so, that Aristotle doesn't. And some of these are things that Aristotle just wouldn't have considered at all because he was writing so much earlier than Horace. Um, so, for example, one of the rules that gets sort of loosened around language, specifically when talking about Latin versus Greek, um, is that Horace kind of goes back and forth on the question of Latin and Greek poetry. Remember, when it comes to Roman authors in Horace's time, Greek is sort of the uh, high poetic language. Horace goes to Rome to study, and he studies in, Latin, which was the language of Rome, but he's studying the Greeks, and so he is educated in both Greek and Latin. In situations like this, the Greek would typically be valued higher. But Horace, at various points in Ars Poetica, says, no, you should just write in Latin if it makes sense to write in Latin. All right. On the other hand, he talks at various points about the ways in which Roman poets, like himself, are held to higher esteem than Greek poets, and he thinks that that's wrong. And so what's interesting about this is for a text that is really, really strict about certain rules and especially around decorum, um, his sense of decorum is actually not as strict as many people presume. Uh, he essentially says that things should be appropriate for whatever is their given circumstance. He doesn't say what that circumstance necessarily is. And so, whereas you'll see um, throughout history, and we're probably not going to cover too many of these really strict authors, but you do see at various points authors sort of point to the sort of high poetic or sacred language as superior, or the opposite. You see authors arguing for the vernacular, which is the sort of everyday language of a particular region. Horace doesn't really argue for one or the other. He basically says that, they each have their place, but you need to be consistent. You need to practice decorum. And while we're on this, I did use a term vernacular, and that's going to be an important term to remember. Horace is not typically credited as being one of the thinkers who makes a big deal of the vernacular, but he does mention writing in Latin versus Greek, and so I wanted to highlight that. Um, it's also interesting that the translation we have here, when it gets to a certain point, let me see, what page is this on? On page 140, at the bottom, the translation says très bien, very good, right? In French. In the original, Horace was writing in Latin, and when he made that statement, he said it in Greek. So why, in the English language, do they do it in French? Because the relationship between English and French is similar to the relationship between Latin and Greek in Horace's time. In the same way that English speakers will use French as what we call the lingua franca, the sort of shared tongue, the language of the intellectuals. Romans in Horace's time would have done the same with Greek. And so this translation is interesting in that it takes some liberties, taking Greek words that are interjected into a Latin treatise, and making them French in the middle of English. The reason for that is the way that these languages interact with each other. And so that's an example of vernacular versus lingua franca, or a sort of sacred language or a colonial language. There are many reasons why certain uses of ancient languages get kind of preserved within other languages. And then there's the concern of art. And the example quote that I have here is, the question was raised whether a praiseworthy poem comes about by nature or by craft. And that's what we really mean when we say art. Art is not just the whole, thing of, anything that is created, any creative act, any beautiful act of intention is art. No, art here means something very specific. It means craft. It means a skill that gets honed. All right. And the question for a very long time, I think you could say even to this day, but especially in scholarly circles, it's more in early theory and criticism. The question is, does good art come from nature or art. You know, does good poetry, does good painting, sculpture, whatever, come from nature? So inborn, inherent, natural, or art, which is a learned craft. Now, Horace sort of he strikes a balance between these two positions. And so for him, poetry entails both art, which is, again, a learned craft, and nature, which is untrained, natural talent. We might call it inspiration. Plato calls it divine madness, right? Now, nature, natural talent, inspiration, whatever you want to call it, cannot be taught. And so Horace's writing prioritizes craft. But that's not to say that he does not also consider the idea of natural talent important. He basically says that you can't even begin to learn without having the talent. So, like any other craft, the art of poetry requires learning, practice, and refinement. He uses this athletic metaphor where he says essentially you wouldn't just jump onto the field of play of any given sport if you haven't practiced. So why do people think they can just write poetry without practicing or learning about it? And so he basically says that a poet should be an expert in poetry. They should be reading poetry. They should be learning about poetry. They should learn the rules of good poetry. And so just like in Aristotle's Poetics, the rules of Horace's decorum, what they do is they help to enact the processes of refining poetry, of practicing the art of poetry. So, although there is the suggestion that none of this can happen without the foundation of talent, which is not taught, it just kind of you luck into it, he still very much departs from Plato. All right. Poetry for Horace is not divine madness. It's not inspiration. It's a honed skill. All right. And that skill, actually, I'll get to that in a second. And then finally, the other thing is the purpose. This is the other concern. He talks about mingling the useful with the sweet, wins every point by alike delighting, excuse me, and advising the reader. The purpose of poetry for Horace is to delight and instruct. Excuse me, I'm blowing my nose. This is one of the most quoted parts of the Ars Poetica, and that's because it really is the sort of mission statement of how he sees poetry. It's the purpose. The purpose is to delight and instruct. Now, this is conceptually aligned with Aristotle's view on catharsis. You'll recall that Aristotle's view on catharsis, he doesn't call out Plato or anything, but it is a rebuttal to Plato's blanket condemnation of mimesis. Plato does not like mimesis. He does not like imitation, all right? Because he considers it to be something that leads people astray by playing on their emotions with falsehoods. Aristotle counters that with the idea of catharsis. The emotions that are manipulated through good poetry, in Aristotle's view, do not lead people astray, but rather create emotions that sort of help refine a person, uh, teach them, enlighten them. Okay? And so Horace doesn't really go into this with catharsis necessarily, but it's a very similar idea that um, poetry entertains and in doing so teaches. Now, he doesn't prioritize either one of those things in value, okay? However, philosophically, there is a very strong suggestion that instruction is the more important, the more weighty. It has the more weight, you know. However, in practice, delight has to come first. This is not just my interpretation. This is if you read Horace carefully, it's in there. Even if you read Aristotle, it's strongly suggested. Delight must come first in practice. And this is for the simple reason that you have to attract people to your message in the first place. There is even a point where Horace describes the average audience of a play as like chaotic and drunk. And he basically says, like, you can teach these people, you can instruct them. First, you have to entertain them, or else they're not going to care. And so, to delight and instruct is the purpose of poetry. Poetry can make us better. Poetry can teach us to be good people. And it does so by first focusing on delighting. Right? You go to a poem because you like poetry, and you leave that poem a more enlightened individual. Right? You can see the clear line in the sand here between Aristotle and Plato, and Horace very, very much on the side of Aristotle. And not only that, but even taking it several steps further by sort of refining the idea. Now, it could be said, of course, that all the other elements of poetry, according to Horace, that we've already discussed, really what they do is they serve this one purpose, to delight and instruct. And that might just sound really obvious, but it's not as obvious as it may sound. Yes, anything that is done within a particular project is going to serve the purpose of that project. But remember, all of this goes together in one unified, harmonious whole. The literary criticism just as much as the poetry. And so when we say that everything serves this, it's not like, you have a bunch of elements that you just add in and they go in a linear fashion and then they sort of pump out this delightful instruction. No, it's all happening together all the time. And that's where the harmony is, right? And so that's Horace. That's the Ars Poetica. I want you to keep that in mind going into On Sublimity by Longinus, which is in many ways the direct opposite. All right. And we'll discuss why that is. We'll discuss why that may not be 100% accurate. And we'll discuss what these thinkers do for subsequent generations of scholars, artists, cultures, etc. Because this stuff is extremely, extremely important. not just for the rest of our discussions, but really for the development of the arts, and specifically poetry as a whole. So, I hope that helped, and I will see you again at the Longinus lecture.